They called it a seat of honor, but it didn't come with a name, and for a long time I didn't think someone like me was allowed to sit in it. Most people think becoming the First Lady of the United States means wealth, power, and privilege. But what they don't tell you is that it also means walking into a room and realizing the chair next to the president, your own chair, has never been made for someone who looks like you. No salary, no job description, no manual, just eyes, watching, judging, measuring, waiting. It wasn't always like this. There was a time I didn't know how to speak up in a room. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't know if I was allowed to be heard. That little girl from South Side Chicago, who grew up in a tiny apartment with thin walls, hand-me-down furniture, and a dream that always seemed 2 blocks too far. They said we didn't belong at Princeton. They said Harvard was a place for legacies, not for black girls with public school grit. They said, "You're only here because of affirmative action." And still, I showed up, with more to prove than anyone around me. But let's pause that story. Before the Ivy League, before the law firm, before the speeches and the world tours, before I became Michelle Obama, the name that kids now write in school essays, I was just Michelle Robinson, a girl whose father worked through pain, whose mother taught her dignity wasn't a luxury. It was armor. And there was a question I carried quietly, almost like a whisper. Who gets to decide what power looks like? The funny thing about power is that sometimes it wears pearls, smiles politely, and sits quietly, but listens fiercely. Sometimes it's not the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the one watching, remembering, preparing. And one day, rising. Becoming doesn't happen in a speech. It happens in silence, in small choices, in rooms that don't clap. If you've ever been the only one, if you've ever walked into a space where people looked at you like you didn't fit, if you've ever doubted whether your voice mattered, this is your story too. Because what I didn't know then, what I learned sitting in that chair beside the president, was that sometimes history gives you a seat, just to see what you'll do with it. But before we get there, let's go back to the beginning, back to the cramped apartment, back to the napkin notes on the fridge, back to a black girl staring out the window, wondering if her dreams had a place in this country. Let's start there. I wasn't born with a silver spoon. Mine was a plastic fork from the south side of Chicago, sometimes cracked, but always clean. Our apartment was on the top floor of a small brick building owned by my great-aunt, Robbie. It was cramped, and the walls were thin, but they held our lives together like patchwork. We had one bathroom, no dryer, and when the heater clanked in the winter, we'd joke that it was just clearing its throat. My room wasn't really a room. It was a corner sectioned off by a divider. But inside that small space, I built dreams taller than the Sears Tower. My father, Fraser Robinson, was a pump operator for the city. He woke early, walked quietly, and came home with grease on his hands and wisdom in his silence. He had multiple sclerosis. His legs were slowly failing, but he never let it show. Not when he helped me with my homework. Not even when the stairs felt like mountains. And then there was my mother, Marion. Quiet power wrapped in a cardigan. She didn't yell, she didn't scold, but she asked sharp questions like, "Does that choice help you become who you want to be?" That question haunted me more than any punishment ever could. We didn't have much, but we had books, we had rules, we had Sunday dinners around the kitchen table where interrupting someone was a sport and holding your ground was survival. I was that little black girl with pigtails and a permanent sense that I had to be better, faster, more prepared, just to be seen as enough. When I started school, I was labeled gifted early. They moved me up a grade. Then again. At first it felt like praise. Then came the whispers. She talks too proper. She thinks she's better? She's not like the rest of us. Kids don't need degrees to know exclusion. You feel it in empty lunch tables, in looks that last a second too long. I learned to smile, but also to scan a room, to measure my worth against walls I never built, but I also learned to fight for space. In second grade, I told a teacher she had misgraded my math test, and she had. In fourth grade, I gave my first piano recital, hitting every note while my fingers trembled. In middle school, I wrote an essay titled, "Why I Want to Be a Pediatrician." Not because I wanted to, but because that was the acceptable dream for smart girls. Still, I worked, because I had a theory. If I could be perfect enough, I could escape the box. I made it into a magnet high school across town. Long commute, early mornings. But I didn't mind. What I did mind was the counselor who looked me in the eye when I said I wanted to go to Princeton and told me, "I'm not sure you're Princeton material." That sentence is branded in my brain, not because it hurt, but because it was wrong. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just applied anyway, wrote the essays, took the SAT, prayed, waited, and when the acceptance letter came, I didn't jump. I just smiled, folded it, and placed it under my pillow. Because the world wasn't going to celebrate me. Not yet. But I could. That's when I realized something. Sometimes the loudest belief in yourself has to come from you, especially when the world goes quiet. People say I came from nothing. But how can you call love, grit, faith, and fire nothing? I came from a home where be on time meant respect others, where do your best meant honor yourself, where failure wasn't fatal, it was fuel. And so I packed my bags for Princeton, a place where people wore wealth like perfume, where I was the only black girl in my dorm hall, where professors often called me Miss Robinson with surprise, as if my presence was a clerical error. But we'll get there. First, you need to understand that the girl who walked onto that Ivy League campus wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just trying to prove to herself that the kitchen table she came from was enough to carry her. When I walked through the gates of Princeton University, I didn't feel like I had arrived. I felt like I had snuck in. The campus was all stone and legacy, sweaters tied around shoulders, laughter that echoed confidence, names etched into benches, buildings, and bronze plaques. None of them sounded like mine. I was Michelle Robinson, a black girl from the south side of Chicago with a cheap suitcase and ironed jeans. I didn't carry a trust fund. I carried pressure. Pressure to prove I belonged. Pressure to speak correctly, but not too boldly. Pressure to smile when professors mispronounced my name, and not correct them. Pressure to walk past security who didn't recognize me, and not take it personally. I sat in lecture halls, where the only other black student was 3 rows away. I joined study groups where silence followed every time I spoke. And when I walked into my academic counselor's office to ask about law school, she said, "You know, Michelle, there are other career paths. Not everyone's cut out for Harvard." There it was again. That invisible name tag I never asked to wear. Not supposed to be here. They never said it outright. They didn't have to. It was in the way they asked where I was really from, the way they assumed I was on scholarship, the way they raised eyebrows when I got A's. But instead of shrinking, I sharpened. I took notes with military precision. I mastered the tone of neutrality. I stayed up late, not just to study, but to silence the voice that whispered I didn't deserve the seat I was in. When I got accepted into Harvard Law School, I didn't celebrate. I exhaled. Harvard was another castle of cold marble and unspoken rules. But by then, I had learned to walk quietly, write fiercely, and leave no room for doubt. By graduation, I had job offers from some of the most prestigious law firms in the country. I chose Sidley and Austin, a polished skyscraper in downtown Chicago, office on the 47th floor, view of Lake Michigan, nameplate on the desk, custom business cards. My title, associate. But despite all that, something inside me still felt unfinished. I knew how to win the game, but I didn't know if it was the game I wanted to play. It was around that time I was assigned to mentor a summer intern, a law student, Harvard, smart, charismatic, late to the first meeting. He walked into the office, tall, lean, with a lopsided grin and a briefcase that looked too empty for someone that confident. His name was Barack Obama, and everything in my life, up to that moment, had been about control, schedules, structure, proof, performance. But this man walked in like he had already made peace with who he was, and didn't need to prove it to anyone. He wasn't loud, but he listened. He didn't brag, but he spoke like every word mattered. He didn't ask me where I was from. He asked me where I was going. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to shrink or shape myself to be accepted. He didn't want my name tag. He wanted my truth. I tried not to fall for him. I was his mentor. I was focused on my career. But love doesn't care about titles. One night we shared a simple dinner. No fancy wine, no grand gestures, just stories. Quiet laughter. Eyes that didn't look past each other, but into. When he walked me home that evening, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Safe. Barack told me he wanted to work in public service, that his dream wasn't just to become successful, but to become useful. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I was building a life based on expectations. He was building one based on conviction. I started to wonder. Had I climbed so far up the ladder that I forgot to ask if it was leaning on the right wall? But before I could answer that question, I had to confront something deeper. What happens when the life you've earned doesn't match the life you desire? That question would follow me for years, through boardrooms, through speeches, through heartbreak, through hope, and one day it would follow me all the way to the White House. But first, I had to face the scariest thing of all. I thought becoming a lawyer would make me feel whole, that the business card, the office view, the tailored suits, they would fill something. But instead, I felt like I was moving forward while leaving myself behind. Barack's world was different. He would skip a firm lunch just to walk across the South Side and talk to people who didn't even know what a law degree was. He read books about systems, justice, poverty, and possibility. He wrote letters to himself about what kind of man he wanted to be. One night, I found one of his notes on our kitchen counter. It wasn't meant for me, but it said, "If I'm not lifting others while I rise, I'm not really rising." That sentence undid me, because I had spent so long rising, but never asked if anyone else was rising with me. At the law firm, I was on the partner track. But at home, I was watching a man dream wider than walls. He once asked me, "Are you happy?" I smiled. I nodded. I changed the subject. But the truth was, I didn't know. Happiness had always been tied to achievement. Straight A's, Ivy League, Harvard Law. But now the boxes were checked, and the silence was louder than ever. Barack talked about leaving the firm, about working in public housing, education reform, about doing less for money and more for meaning. And I couldn't understand it. You want to leave this job? For what? To be broke and noble? But I wasn't angry. I was afraid. Because deep down, I knew his question wasn't just for him. Was I becoming, or just trying to belong? We got serious. We talked about marriage, about purpose, about who we were, and who we wanted to be. I asked myself if love was enough to carry me through a life that might not always be comfortable. He asked himself if his ambition could hold space for my identity. And together, we started writing a future that was messy, uncertain, but honest. Barack left the firm first. I watched him walk down the hallway that I once dreamed of conquering, and never look back. I stayed a little longer, because I wasn't ready to let go of the security, of the expectation, of the version of Michelle that people respected. But every morning I sat at that desk, something inside me softened, shifted, then finally cracked. So I left. I didn't have a master plan, just a whisper that said, maybe you don't have to choose between power and purpose. Maybe you redefine both. I started working in city government, then a non-profit, lower salary, no prestige. But I woke up lighter. I smiled more. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just living to meet expectations. I was living to create impact. And yet, even as my world opened, so did the judgment. Some said I was wasting my degree. Some said I was just following my man. Some asked if I regretted stepping away from corporate law. And the truth is, I didn't, because I was stepping into something else. A life that made sense to my soul, not just my resume. Barack and I grew closer. We debated, challenged, respected, loved, and laughed. History doesn't prepare you for the spotlight, and when you're a black woman in America, it often forgets to write you in at all. When Barack began his political journey, I wasn't chasing the title of First Lady. I was focused on Sasha's naps, Malia's school lunches, and keeping our lives stitched together with string and prayer. But then the cameras came, the headlines, the questions. Is she too assertive? Too angry? Too educated? Too black? Suddenly, my tone became a threat. My smile became strategy. And my silence was never enough. I wasn't just Michelle anymore. I was Obama's wife. The black woman next to the podium. A problem or a symbol. They judged my arms, my dresses, my eyebrows, my hugs. She doesn't act like a first lady. She's never been in politics. She should smile more. And in the middle of all that noise, I still had to show up for school pickup, still had to iron uniforms, still had to be the calm at the center of a storm I didn't create. I remember one morning I looked into the mirror, exhausted, frustrated, doubted, and I said aloud, almost defiantly, "You will not disappear." That became my mantra, because I realized, in a world that constantly tried to shrink me, my presence was resistance. Just showing up, as I was radical. I didn't have to shout to be heard. I didn't have to fight to be powerful. I just had to stand in my truth and stay there. When Barack became president, people asked what kind of first lady I would be. I didn't have an answer. There was no manual, no precedent for a black woman in that role, no blueprint. So I made my own. I walked into schools across the country, not to pose, but to listen. I planted gardens with children who'd never touched soil before. I hugged veterans. I danced with students. I cried with mothers. I laughed with janitors. And slowly, quietly, something changed. Not in the world, but in me. I stopped asking for permission to be myself. I started owning the space I stood in. Still, it wasn't easy. Some days, I felt invisible in rooms full of applause. Some days, I carried the weight of being the first like a brick in my chest. Some days, I smiled through tears because the work wasn't done. But I kept showing up, even when it was uncomfortable, even when I was misunderstood, even when I doubted my own impact, because I remembered what my father taught me. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room, just the most present. That's what I tried to be. Present. Present for my daughters, present for my country, present for the millions of women watching, wondering if they could belong somewhere they were never meant to enter. If I had waited to be ready, I would have missed everything. Because the truth is, you become ready by showing up, not before. And so I kept showing up. To press conferences, to community events, to late-night talks on the White House balcony. And in those moments, quiet, unglamorous, unfiltered, I felt it. That maybe I wasn't just beside history. Maybe I was shaping it. Not with power, not with policy, but with presence. They called me First Lady. But for a long time, I didn't know what that meant. There were no job descriptions, no salary, no seat at the decision table. Just expectation. Be elegant, be neutral, be safe, be seen, but not too much. Smile, but not too widely. Speak, but not too honestly. And don't, under any circumstance, make people uncomfortable. But discomfort was exactly what made me. I came from a neighborhood where people worked 2 jobs and still worried about dinner, where women led with grace even when the world offered them none, where we didn't have the luxury of being invisible. So no, I wasn't going to disappear into a White House portrait. I was going to build something real. We started with a garden. Yes, a literal one. Behind the most powerful house in the world, I dug my hands into the earth. With school kids, with sweat, with intention. Because if a child in a food desert can grow spinach beside the rose garden, then maybe they'll believe they belong in more places than they've been told. Next came Let's Move, a national campaign to fight childhood obesity, not just policy, but play. We danced, we cooked, we ran, and we reminded America, health is not a privilege, it's a right. Then came joining forces, support for military families, reach higher, college access for underserved students. Let girls learn. Global education for girls who were told their only future was silence. But the turning point was when I stepped onto a stage and opened a book. My book, Becoming, not a memoir, but a mirror. A story about South Side Chicago, about insecurity, about ambition, about being the first, about being the only, about not being too much, and then choosing to be anyway. I spoke to rooms filled with young girls, immigrant mothers, sons raised by grandmothers, women in midlife rediscovering themselves. And in every face, I saw the same question I used to ask. Am I allowed to be fully me and still be enough? My answer? Yes, loudly, boldly, unapologetically, and yes. Being First Lady didn't define me, but it gave me a microphone. And once I had that mic, I passed it on to girls in Flint, Michigan, to teenagers in Cambodia, to teachers in inner-city schools, to mothers raising black sons in a world that doesn't always see them fully. I didn't want them to wait until they were invited. I wanted them to walk in like they belonged. Because if a girl who once slept in a small apartment with no private room could stand in the center of a world stage, then anyone could. Leadership isn't about titles. It's about showing what's possible. But it wasn't easy. With every step forward came resistance. With every bold word came backlash. With every gesture of strength came accusations of arrogance. But I remembered what my mother once told me. You don't owe anyone softness to make them comfortable with you. After 8 years in the White House, the cameras turned away. The headlines moved on. The motorcades disappeared. And for the first time in a long time, I walked into a room without anyone announcing my name. But something had changed. Not the world, me. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was choosing where to look. So I looked down to the little black girl in the front row of a high school gym in Detroit, to the teenage boy in a hoodie who sat back but didn't blink, to the nervous college student with a trembling voice asking, "How do I know I'm enough?" And I told them the truth. You're already enough. You just haven't been told it loud enough, long enough, or by enough people who look like you. That's why I keep showing up. Because we don't become alone. We become together. Becoming is not a solo act. It's a relay, a conversation, a chorus of voices, some shaky, some sure, rising in the same direction. I stood on the shoulders of my parents, my teachers, my community. Now others stand on mine. And that's not pressure, that's privilege. Every time I visit a school and see a little girl raise her hand with fire in her eyes, I remember I was her once. Every time I see a young boy share his art with shaking hands, I remember Barack was him once. And I don't want them to become me. I want them to become them, fully, freely, fiercely. Because the world doesn't need another Michelle Obama. It needs someone who reads her story and starts writing their own. I speak at graduations, I talk with inmates and CEOs, I walk into book clubs and back alley schools. Not because I love microphones, but because I love mirrors, and every person I speak to, every young mind I meet, is a mirror, reflecting back hope, potential, courage. When I published Becoming, I didn't expect the response. The letters, the tears, the confessions whispered between pages. But the most powerful messages were always the same. You made me feel seen. You reminded me I matter. I thought I was the only one. And here's the thing. That's all any of us really want. To be seen, to be known, to be believed in, even when we don't believe in ourselves. So I don't call what I do a movement. I call it a table, a place to sit, to speak, to listen, to laugh, to cry. A table with... There's something strange about coming full circle. You spend a lifetime reaching for the next step, the next degree, the next title, the next version of yourself. And then, one day, you stop climbing. Not because you've given up, but because you've finally arrived. Not at the top, but at yourself. That's what it felt like the day I sat in that chair beside the president. The one with no nameplate, no job description, no roadmap, just expectation and legacy. The same seat I spoke of before. The one that made me feel small, uncertain, invisible. But this time it felt different. Not because the chair had changed. Because I had. I no longer needed someone to name the chair for me. I knew who I was. Not just Michelle Obama, First Lady, but Michelle Robinson, daughter of Southside grit and kitchen table wisdom. I had made peace with not fitting into the mold. I had turned judgment into fuel. I had turned silence into speeches, and doubt into direction. And most of all, I had turned a borrowed seat into a place others could follow. You see, I never wanted to belong to the White House. I wanted to bring something of my house into it. The laughter, the questions, the courage to ask for more. Even after we left 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I didn't leave that chair behind. Because now, it lives everywhere. It lives in classrooms where girls hold microphones and speak without trembling. It lives in courtrooms where black women argue cases their grandmothers weren't allowed to witness. It lives in every hallway where someone decides they don't need permission to lead. I no longer worry about becoming important. I'm more interested in becoming whole. There's no applause for that. No podium. No bestseller list. Just peace. And that's enough. So now I travel lighter. I smile more. I rest more. I dream more. Not just for me, but for the world I hope still believes in change. Because becoming doesn't end when the credits roll. It doesn't stop when the doors close. It doesn't retire with a title. It continues in quiet acts, in hard choices, in walking away from what's easy and toward what's right. That's what home is, after all. Not a building, not a throne, not even a chair. Home is wherever you finally stop pretending, where you are no longer becoming, but simply being and